When you first hear someone say the phrase quantum shifting, your mind might leap toward images you didn't ask for. You may picture secret rites performed under night skies, whispered formulas spoken by people who seem to live just beyond ordinary life, or long ascetic journeys that promise access to realms you were told only masters can reach. And yet, friend, notice how quickly those images create distance between you and your own potential. Notice how effortlessly the mind builds a myth to convince you that this path must belong to someone else. You've been trained to believe that anything powerful must be hidden behind a locked door. That transformation requires strain. That change has to feel heavy to count. But what if that belief is the very fog that keeps you circling the same inner territory again and again? Imagine this instead. What if quantum shifting is not mystical spectacle, but natural mechanics? What if the unseen isn't foreign, but familiar, so familiar you've overlooked it? You may begin to sense that the difficulty you've been expecting is not part of the process, but part of your conditioning. Our culture loves to glorify effort. It praises the warrior who bleeds, the builder who grinds, the seeker who crawls through years of friction just to claim a single moment of breakthrough. So when you approach manifestation with that inheritance, you expect the quantum to demand the same sacrifice. You expect reality to bend only if you push hard enough. But here's the pattern interrupt. The field doesn't respond to tension. It responds to coherence. Alignment requires precision, not pressure. It's a key slipping into place, not a door being kicked open. Physics, in its humble, suggestive way, hints that the smallest particles transform without strain. They shift when conditions match, not when force is applied. And you, standing here at the edge of your next becoming, may realize the same is true for you. You may feel the echo of that last truth, still vibrating the sense that transformation doesn't require force, only coherence. And it's from that quiet recognition that the next layer emerges, because the moment you touch ease, something inside you flinches. You felt it before, a subtle tightening, a reflexive doubt, a whisper that says, "Careful, ease is suspicious." That reaction isn't failure, it's conditioning. It's the old identity guarding its territory. Your nervous system has been sculpted by years of repetition, emotional patterns rehearsed like sacred rituals. Stories echoed in your mind so often they no longer sound like stories. They sound like truth. And truth, even uncomfortable truth, feels safe simply because it's familiar. So when a new state begins to rise, one that asks for softness instead of strain, your body sends out the same alarm it would send if you stepped off a cliff. Because to the old identity, ease looks like risk. Pause with that. Let it breathe. Why would the mind treat something gentle as dangerous? Because struggle has been normalized as proof of effort. You were taught to treat tension like currency. You were told that suffering makes you worthy, that exhaustion means you've earned progress, that grinding is the only noble path to change. The identity formed in that environment learned to measure its value by how much it endured. And anything that doesn't match that template feels wrong, even if it's exactly what you've been praying for. This is the paradox the old self trusts. Struggle more than it trusts possibility. So when ease arrives, the old circuitry misreads it as a threat, a void, a trap. It whispers, don't relax, don't soften, don't open. If it's this easy, you'll lose everything. But those warnings aren't wisdom. They're muscle memory. They're remnants of a survival system built in a different season of your life. Imagine a traveler carrying a heavy pack across a desert, convinced they need every item inside to stay alive. Even when they reach fertile ground, they keep hauling the weight because they don't trust the new landscape. They don't believe water can be this close. They don't believe the danger is gone. They cling to the burden long after it stops serving them. Your old identity does the same. It drags struggle into environments where ease is finally possible. And here's the deeper turn: the body interprets every emotional repetition as a signal of safety. If your history taught you that fear is normal, your nervous system will seek out fear simply to feel regulated. If disappointment became your familiar companion, your mind will unconsciously look for situations that recreate that emotion, because stability matters more to the survival brain than joy. This is not a flaw. It's biology doing its job. But biology can learn, identity can evolve. Notice how, when you begin to shift into a new state, there's a subtle tug pulling you back toward the known. You start imagining new possibilities, and suddenly, the old voice rises. Who do you think you are? Don't get ahead of yourself. Don't be naive. That voice isn't trying to sabotage you. It's trying to protect the version of you that believed safety lived in limitation. But here's the pattern: interrupt. That version of you is outdated. It knows how to survive the past, but not how to inhabit the future. Ease threatens it, not because ease is wrong, but because ease would dissolve the identity that was built around struggle. And identities cling to existence the way flames cling to oxygen. They don't let go willingly. They let go when you stop feeding them. So the first doorway into effortless shifting isn't forcing a transformation. It's teaching your nervous system that ease is not danger. It's teaching your identity that effort is not proof. It's teaching your emotions that unfamiliar doesn't equal unsafe. You do this gently, not through grand gestures, but through small permissions: a single breath softened, a single thought redirected, a single moment where you choose relaxation over contraction. These micro permissions begin rewiring the body, telling it you're allowed to expand now. You're allowed to receive without bracing. You're allowed to open without fear. When those signals accumulate, the old identity loses its authority. Ease stops feeling like risk. It starts feeling like recognition. And that recognition becomes the bridge into the next layer, the physics of effortless collapse, where alignment replaces effort and the inner signal becomes the true engine of change. The last section left you standing at the threshold, where ease stops feeling dangerous and begins to feel possible. And from that softened place, a new question rises almost automatically. If the struggle was never required, then what actually drives the shift? This is where the physics metaphor opens like a quiet door, not as dogma, but as a way of seeing, a way of understanding why alignment matters more than force. Because when you look at the world through the lens of modern physics, humbly, metaphorically, you discover something surprising. The smallest building blocks of existence don't strain their way into form. They respond. They match conditions. They settle into outcomes without the slightest hint of effort. Let that sink in for a moment. A wave doesn't push itself into becoming a particle. It collapses the moment coherence arrives. We aren't claiming that your life follows quantum rules with mechanical precision. That would be far too literal. But the metaphor illuminates a pattern your intuition already knows. Reality shifts more readily when you stop pulling against it. When your inner state stops contradicting itself. When your signal becomes clean enough that the field, however you choose to define it, can respond without interruption. Imagine the way a tuning fork vibrates. Strike one, and the other vibrates in sympathy if they share the same frequency. No force, no pressure, just resonance. The same principle appears, in its own way, within you. When your thoughts move in one direction, your emotions in another, and your body in a third, the internal frequency becomes noise, scattered, diffused, contradictory. Nothing stabilizes, nothing locks into place. You're broadcasting a signal that can't quite land. But when thought, feeling, and body begin to align even in micro moments, the static drops. Your state becomes coherent, and coherence, by its nature, influences outcomes more effectively than force ever could. Think of superposition not as a scientific claim about your destiny, but as a metaphor for the hidden layers of your potential. Every version of you exists as a possibility: the grounded one, the fearful one, the empowered one, the one who trusts, the one who doubts, the one who rises, the one who hides. These aren't mystical fantasy, they're psychological states waiting for consistency. Each one holds its own pattern of perception, its own emotional climate, its own gravitational pull on the choices you make. When your state becomes coherent, you collapse into one of those versions more decisively. You choose not consciously every time, but biologically. Effort doesn't cause the collapse. Coherence does. This is why you can grind and push and force yourself for months and feel nothing shift, because your mind might be visualizing a new reality, but your body is still bracing for an old one. Your thoughts may whisper possibility, but your emotions are rehearsing disappointment. And the body, being the older and more primal intelligence, broadcasts the louder signal. But here's the deeper turn: once you begin aligning the internal layers, collapse becomes less like an achievement and more like gravity. It happens naturally. It happens quickly. It happens the moment contradiction falls away. Consider it like adjusting a lens on a camera. Turning the ring requires almost no effort, but the moment the pieces align, an entire scene snaps into clarity. The world didn't change. Your focus did. And that shift in focus created a new experience of reality. Reality may not literally behave like a quantum field, but the metaphor reveals an emotional truth. Clarity creates a different world than confusion. Coherence creates outcomes that chaos never will. And if you've ever had a moment where everything just clicked, where something you chased for years arrived the moment you finally relaxed, you've felt this truth in motion. You didn't force the collapse. You became available to it. Here's the pattern interrupt. In the deepest sense, collapse is not something you do. It's something you allow. The conditions that lead to effortless collapse aren't mystical at all. They're simple alignment between intention and embodiment, agreement between thought and feeling, resonance between who you say you are and who you act like in the quiet moments when no one is watching. This is why force backfires. The moment you try to make reality shift, you confirm to yourself that it hasn't shifted. Force reinforces separation. Coherence dissolves it. And once that truth settles in your body, the next question becomes inevitable. If collapse responds to coherence, what shapes coherence in the first place? What wires the emotional and neurological loops that either support or sabotage your alignment? That doorway leads directly into the biology of identity, the hidden circuitry that determines which version of reality you collapse into by default. You can feel the echo of that last realization that collapse follows coherence, not force still humming inside you. And from that hum, another truth begins to rise. Coherence isn't just a matter of intention. It's shaped by the identity your biology has been rehearsing for years. Because the moment you try to live as a new version of yourself, the body often answers first, and it usually answers with the past. Your identity isn't just a story you tell. It's a circuitry you wear. Every emotion you've practiced, fear, confidence, doubt, gratitude, leaves a trace in your nervous system. Fire a pattern enough times and the brain reinforces it, thickens it, turns it into the path of least resistance. Not because it's true, not because it's aligned, simply because it's efficient. And the body, always trying to conserve energy, prefers efficiency over possibility. This is why you may wake up ready to embody a new self, only to feel old emotions pulling you back before you even leave the bed. The body isn't sabotaging you. It's following a script it memorized long before you decided to change it. Pause and let that land. Most of your identity is recycled, automatic, unquestioned, like an actor who never left the stage when the scene ended. And because the body clings to familiar states, it interprets new emotional territory as instability. If you've spent years practicing disappointment, hope will feel like a threat. If you've been conditioned to brace for loss, openness will register as danger. The old circuitry scans for the familiar, even when the familiar is the very thing you're trying to outgrow. This is why willpower alone collapses. It's trying to rewrite a script the body refuses to acknowledge. Identity is not an idea. Identity is a loop. Thought triggers emotion. Emotion triggers chemistry. Chemistry reinforces the story. The story triggers more thoughts. Around and around it goes. And here's the deeper turn: your biology doesn't distinguish between an emotional state that harms you and one that helps you. It only distinguishes between what's familiar and unfamiliar. So when you attempt to embody a new reality, the body often pushes back, not because the new state is wrong, but because it's unpracticed. Think of a radio tuned to a station you've listened to for years. Even if the signal is full of static, it's still recognizable. And when you try to tune to a clearer, higher frequency station, the dial resists, not mechanically, but habitually. You've spent so long turning toward the old frequency that your hand moves there automatically. Identity works the same way. But this is where the pattern interrupt reveals itself. You don't need to force the old station to disappear. You only need to stop feeding it attention. When you introduce small moments of congruence, a breath where your body relaxes instead of tensing, a choice that matches your desired self instead of your familiar one, a single thought that stands outside the old narrative, the nervous system begins to take notice. It begins to update its understanding of safety. It begins to learn that the future is not as dangerous as the past made it seem. These tiny rehearsals matter more than grand visions, because identity rewires through repetition, not intensity. Imagine practicing the emotions of your new reality in microdoses. Not trying to leap into a fully formed version of yourself overnight, but building small bridges of coherence throughout your day. A moment of gratitude where you once felt dread. A posture of openness where you once shrank. A breath of ease where you once braced. Bit by bit, the biology adapts. Old circuits quiet, new circuits ignite, and without warning, the identity that once felt impossible becomes the default. The unfamiliar becomes natural. The body stops dragging you backward and starts walking with you. This is where coherence begins to stabilize, not as a concept, but as a lived state. And once identity loosens its old grip, another doorway appears: the choice between familiar suffering and unfamiliar freedom. You can feel the circuitry from the last section still unwinding, the recognition that identity isn't fixed, only practiced. And as those old patterns loosen, another truth floats to the surface like something long buried finally rising for air. The biggest barrier to shifting isn't the new reality you're trying to enter. It's the old story you've mistaken for yourself. Because the past has a strange talent. It knows how to disguise itself as logic. Every emotion you've repeated, every belief you've carried for years, every assumption your nervous system has rehearsed, they gather into a narrative so familiar it stops feeling optional. You begin to confuse memory with identity, and identity with truth, and truth, once it feels familiar, becomes a cage you don't even notice you're inside. This is why people cling to suffering far more easily than they reach for freedom. Not because suffering feels good, but because suffering feels known. Let that settle for a moment. The old story doesn't survive because it's empowering. It survives because it's predictable. Predictability calms the survival brain. It gives the nervous system a sense of control, even if the cost is repeating the very patterns you want to escape. That's why the moment you step toward a new version of yourself, the old narrative rises like a tide. Be careful. Don't trust this. You've been here before. Remember what happened. But here's the critical insight. The old story doesn't warn you based on truth. It warns you based on familiarity. Imagine someone standing inside a dimly lit room they've lived in for years. The shadows are familiar. The corners are predictable. Even the discomfort feels manageable. Then someone opens the door to a bright landscape outside. The light is overwhelming. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's new. And the person retreats not out of wisdom, but out of habit. You've done that too. We all have. And yet the doorway remains open. The mind will always attempt to pull you back toward what it understands. That's its job. But the self you're becoming asks for something beyond understanding. It asks for willingness. It asks for the courage to step into emotional territory that your biology hasn't mapped yet. This is where unlearning begins. Unlearning is not erasing the past. Unlearning is removing the authority you once gave it. The old story will still whisper, it may still tug at your sleeve, but you stop treating it as prophecy and start treating it as residue, a leftover script that doesn't belong to the identity you're stepping into. And this is where the paradox emerges. Freedom rarely feels like freedom at first. Freedom feels like uncertainty, because uncertainty is the birthplace of all possibility. And possibility is the one landscape your old identity can't navigate. Consider how often you've sabotaged yourself, not because the new reality was wrong, but because it felt too open, too spacious, too unlike anything the past prepared you for. People mistake that openness for danger when, in truth, it's simply the absence of old walls. This is why the quantum metaphor resonates so deeply, not because your life literally follows subatomic rules, but because possibility expands in the same way. When you stop rehearsing the old state, when you interrupt the familiar emotional loops, the field of who you can become widens. It grows, it opens, and in that opening, you're invited to choose familiar suffering or unfamiliar freedom, the known cage or the uncharted horizon, the self you've rehearsed or the self you're ready to embody. Most people choose the cage not because they lack desire, but because they lack practice living without it. Freedom is a skill. Expansion is a skill. Receiving without bracing is a skill. And like any skill, it becomes natural only through repetition. This is why small acts of unlearning matter. A moment where you question an automatic thought, a breath where you interrupt a habitual emotional reaction, a decision where you choose curiosity over fear. These micro unlearnings carve new space inside you, space where the new identity can root, space where coherence can grow. And from that growing coherence emerges the truth waiting in the next section. That embodiment, not thought, not intention alone, becomes the real signal that collapses a new version of reality around you. You can feel the air shift after unlearning begins, the soft awareness that the old story isn't an authority but a habit. And from that realization comes a deeper invitation. If the mind is no longer steering from the past, then what becomes the true signal of your new reality? The answer doesn't rise in words, it rises in the body. Because thought alone doesn't collapse anything. Thought is a spark. Embodiment is the current. You've been told for years to think positive, to visualize what you want, to repeat affirmations until your life rearranges itself. But thought without embodiment is like striking a match in a storm, bright for a moment, then swallowed by the wind of old emotions. The body always broadcasts louder. Pause and notice that. Your posture, your breath, your micro-reactions, the subtle chemistry moving through your bloodstream, these are the actual signals shaping your experience. They determine what feels possible. They determine what feels safe. They determine which version of reality your nervous system collapses into before the mind even interprets the moment. This is why someone can affirm abundance but still contract at the thought of paying a bill. It's why someone can visualize love yet brace when closeness appears. The body is speaking a different language than the mind and the field. However you conceptualize it, responds to the signal that's consistent, not the one that's loud. Here's the deeper turn: embodiment is not an outcome. Embodiment is a practice. It's the way you breathe when no one is watching, the way you hold your shoulders when you enter a room, the way your chest tightens or loosens when someone asks how you're doing, the way your gut responds when opportunity knocks. In those micro moments, the body casts its vote, and the vote becomes the collapse. Consider this: if you say, "I'm ready," but your breath is shallow, your muscles tense, and your instincts recoil, the nervous system doesn't believe your words. It defaults to the familiar state because the familiar state feels safer, not better, safer. But when your body begins to soften even slightly, the internal landscape changes. A new signal emerges, one built not on force, but on congruence. Your biology starts behaving as if the reality you're choosing is already here, already integrated, already lived in. This is the essence of alignment: not pretending, not performing, not forcing a new identity, but allowing your physiology to catch up with your intention. Think of the body as the amplifier. Thoughts are the tuning dial. Emotions are the vibration. Embodiment is the broadcast. When the broadcast stabilizes, life responds differently. People react differently. Possibilities that once slipped past unnoticed begin to catch your attention, not because the world changed, but because your signal did. And here's the pattern interrupt. You don't embody a new reality after it arrives. You embody it before. This is the paradox that dissolves resistance. When you breathe like someone who trusts, your decisions change. When you stand like someone who deserves, your opportunities shift. When you move like someone who has nothing to defend, conversations unfold with new possibilities. The body becomes the evidence before the evidence appears. And once embodiment becomes your signal, you step into a new stage of the shift. The practical gateways that train the body into coherence so the collapse can happen naturally, without strain. That doorway opens into the next section, where simplicity becomes strategy and 4 quiet practices begin shaping reality from the inside out. You can feel how embodiment began to reshape the inner terrain, how the body, not the mind alone, became the true transmitter of your chosen reality. And from that shift, a natural question rises: how do you train the body into coherence so the signal stays stable, clear, and effortless? The answer is not found in complex rituals or elaborate systems. It rests in 4 simple gateways, each one quiet enough to ignore, yet powerful enough to reorder your entire field when practiced with consistency. These gateways are breath, imagination from within, the sleep state, and micro-actions. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but profoundly effective. Let's begin with the breath, the original tuning fork of the nervous system. Most people breathe as if they're bracing for impact. Shallow inhales, tight chests, rushed rhythms. That pattern tells the body to prepare for threat. Yet when you elongate the exhale, even slightly, the heart begins to find a smoother rhythm. The nervous system shifts from survival into presence. And presence is where coherence begins. Breath isn't symbolic here, it's mechanical. Each slow cycle tells the brain you're safe enough to open. And openness is the first requirement of collapse. From breath, we move to imagination, not wishful thinking, but placement. The difference is subtle yet transformative. Most people imagine what they want as if they're watching it through a window, distant, far off, aspirational. But the body doesn't respond to distance. The body responds to immersion. When you imagine from within the scene, feeling textures, hearing sounds, sensing weight and warmth, the brain fires the same circuits it would fire if the experience were real. You're rehearsing the future as a memory rather than as a fantasy. And the nervous system begins to trust it. This is how embodiment is trained through repetition that feels lived, not observed. Then comes the sleep state, the doorway most people dismiss because it feels too simple. Yet in those last few minutes before drifting into unconsciousness, the mind enters a receptive state where the barrier between intention and programming thins. If you fall asleep inside resentment, fear, or replayed disappointments, the subconscious spends hours reinforcing the old story. But if you fall asleep inside gratitude, or inside the emotional echo of your chosen identity, you seed the new circuitry where it matters most, in the layers of mind that determine your automatic reactions. The world you wake into begins to shift, not because your circumstances changed overnight, but because your biology started filtering reality through a new emotional reference point. Finally, we reach micro-actions, the outer reflection of inner alignment. People underestimate them because they expect transformation to come from monumental choices, not small ones. But the nervous system builds identity through evidence, and evidence is created through action. One small decision, eating like someone who values their body, speaking like someone who trusts their worth, investing like someone who believes in their future, sends a signal of consistency. Consistency builds coherence, and coherence collapses reality. These gateways don't change the field through force. They change you, and the field responds to the version of you that shows up repeatedly. Here's the pattern interrupt. You don't need to master all four at once. You only need to practice one doorway long enough for your biology to recognize the new rhythm. Then the others become easier. Then alignment becomes natural. Then collapse becomes inevitable. And from that inevitability, a new phenomenon begins to appear, the ripple effect, where your inner coherence subtly reshapes the environment around you in ways that seem mysterious until you understand their origin. That ripple is waiting in the next section. You can feel how the gateways have begun to synchronize something inside you, breath softening the body, imagination rooting new circuits, sleep carrying intention deeper, micro-actions giving identity evidence to stand on. And from that growing coherence, another realization arises almost naturally. Your shift doesn't stop with you. The moment your inner state stabilizes, something subtle begins to echo outward, shaping the world around you in ways you may not immediately recognize. This is the ripple effect, the quiet influence your field exerts, without force, effort, or persuasion. It's not mystical in the sense of violating nature. It's mystical in the sense that it operates beneath the noise of ordinary awareness. You've felt it before, and everyone has. You enter a room and sense tension without anyone speaking, or you meet someone calm, grounded, and present, and your chest loosens without knowing why. These exchanges happen long before words appear. Your state radiates, not dramatically, not theatrically, but consistently. Coherence has a signature, and that signature is felt by every nervous system around you. Humans are biologically wired for resonance. You mirror the emotions, postures, and energies of the people near you. Their breath subtly invites yours to match. Their tension nudges your muscles to tighten. Their calm encourages your body to unwind. No one announces this. It simply happens. Now imagine what unfolds when you begin sustaining coherence rather than visiting it occasionally. The ripple strengthens, it moves outward, shaping interactions, guiding conversations, altering the small but significant micro-choices of those around you. Not because you are imposing your state, but because coherence is contagious. Stability is contagious. presence is contagious. Think of it like a tuning fork struck in a quiet room. Nearby objects begin to vibrate in sympathy, not because the tuning fork demands it, but because resonance follows the path of least resistance. When you embody a grounded signal, you make it easier for others to match than to resist. Their biology recognizes the stability and orients toward it. This is why relationships shift when you shift, why opportunities appear when you soften, why conversations deepen when your body stays open. The ripple doesn't alter the external world directly. It alters the internal conditions that shape how the external world responds to you. Here's the deeper turn: the ripple is strongest precisely when you're not trying to use it. When influence becomes a byproduct of coherence, not an objective. Force scatters the signal. Presence amplifies it. Consider a scenario: two people enter the same environment. One carries unresolved fear, and their field collapses every ambiguous moment into danger. The other carries coherence, and their field collapses the same moment into opportunity. Over minutes, the people around them subtly adapt. One group becomes tense, quick to defend. The other becomes receptive, more willing to engage. The environment didn't change. The field within each person shaped how it was received and how others responded in turn. This is the beginning of quiet leadership. Not leadership through authority, but leadership through embodiment. And here's the pattern interrupt: the ripple doesn't wait for perfection. It begins the moment you hold coherence even a little longer than you used to. It begins the moment you refuse to shrink. It begins the moment you breathe instead of brace. Over days and weeks, those ripples accumulate. They shift dynamics. They reorganize opportunities. They tilt probability toward alignment. And once you understand this, the next question emerges: what happens when coherence isn't momentary but sustained? When ripples stack into waves? When the inner shift is no longer episodic, but a lifestyle? That wave is waiting in the next section. You can feel the last section still vibrating through you, the recognition that your coherence doesn't simply change your experience. It influences the space around you in quiet, undeniable ways. And if a single coherent moment can create ripples, the natural progression becomes impossible to ignore. What happens when coherence stops being occasional and starts becoming your new baseline? That's when the ripple transforms into something far more powerful, a tidal wave. Because sustained coherence doesn't accumulate linearly, it compounds. At first, you feel small shifts, a smoother conversation, a decision made without fear, a moment where you hold your center instead of collapsing into old patterns. But with consistency, the nervous system recalibrates. What used to require effort becomes instinct. What once felt unfamiliar becomes normal. And when coherence becomes normal, your reality begins to rearrange in ways that outsiders may call luck, timing, or coincidence. Even though you know it's none of those things, sustained coherence changes your gravitational pull. You've met people like this, individuals who seem to move through life with an ease that defies logic. Doors open for them. Support appears without them demanding it. Opportunities gather like metal filings drawn to a magnet. They're not pushing reality. They're aligning with it. They've built a field so internally consistent that the external world can't help but bend toward it. This isn't magic. It's momentum. Every day you hold coherence, even imperfectly. You reinforce the emotional and neurological pathways that support the identity you're stepping into. And after enough repetitions, the old identity stops trying to reclaim power because there's nothing left for it to stand on. The body stops bracing, the mind stops doubting, the emotions stop predicting danger. You begin to move through the world with a quiet certainty, not loud, not performative, but grounded. And groundedness is highly magnetic. Sustained coherence creates long horizon shifts because it changes the conditions under which collapse occurs. When your internal state becomes stable, the field, metaphorically speaking, starts selecting outcomes that match that stability. Relationships that once felt chaotic begin smoothing. Financial patterns that once felt unpredictable begin stabilizing. Creative impulses that once felt fragile become consistent. Health shifts subtly as stress chemistry dissolves and ease chemistry becomes your baseline. None of this requires perfection. It requires repetition, because repetition communicates to the body. This is who we are now, and the body listens. The old story fades not with force, but with lack of nourishment. The new identity strengthens through microproofs, through daily coherence, through small reminders that you are no longer collapsing the past by default. Here's the deeper turn. Sustained coherence doesn't just influence outcomes, it influences timing. Opportunities that were previously inaccessible begin to align without strain because you are no longer oscillating between states. Your signal is steady enough for the world to recognize. The horizon you're moving toward becomes clearer because you're no longer sending mixed messages into the field. You're no longer shifting between expansion and contraction. You're no longer rehearsing the old while reaching for the new. Consistency turns the future into something that feels less like uncertainty and more like inevitability. And that inevitability isn't passive. It's not waiting for destiny to choose you. It's you choosing who you are over and over until reality has no option but to respond. This is the threshold where transformation stops being episodic and becomes embodied. And once you feel that embodiment settling into your bones, only one question remains. Who do you become when ease is no longer a temporary state, but your new identity? That identity takes center stage in the next section. You can feel how the last section landed, that deep recognition that sustained coherence doesn't just influence isolated moments, but the entire arc of your life. And from that momentum, another realization begins to rise. Gentle but undeniable. If coherence becomes your baseline, then who are you now? What identity emerges when ease is no longer a rare visitor, but the way you move through the world? This is the essence of the ease paradigm, not a technique, not a state you dip into, but an identity you inhabit, an identity built on alignment rather than effort, on presence rather than pressure, on embodied certainty rather than mental negotiation. Because once coherence settles, the version of you who struggled for every inch of progress starts to dissolve. Not through force, not through rejection, but through irrelevance. They simply don't match the frequency you now occupy. Their logic doesn't make sense anymore. Their fears feel outdated. Their habits feel heavy, and slowly, without drama, you find yourself behaving like someone who no longer needs to become anything. You simply are. This identity doesn't posture or perform. It doesn't chase validation or reassurance. It doesn't bargain with the field. It participates. It aligns. It chooses. And those choices come from a place so deeply rooted in ease that struggle feels foreign. Not because life becomes perfect, but because your relationship to life changes. You stop interpreting challenges as evidence you're failing. You stop interpreting pauses as rejection. You stop interpreting uncertainty as danger. Instead, every moment becomes information, a signal, an invitation to stay coherent rather than collapse into old stories. Let that shift move through you. The identity of the already aligned self acts differently. It breathes differently. It speaks from a grounded tone rather than a defensive one. It listens without scanning for threat. It rests without guilt. It takes action without desperation. It expresses without over-explaining. It trusts that what matches its signal will arrive not because of entitlement, but because coherence makes receiving natural. Think of an instrument finely tuned. It doesn't create harmony by effort. It creates harmony because tension has been released. You become that instrument. The ease is not passive, it's precise. It's a clarity that cuts through noise, a confidence that doesn't need to announce itself, a presence that doesn't wobble at the first sign of uncertainty. And here's the deeper turn: living the ease paradigm doesn't mean you never feel old emotions. It means you no longer identify with them. Fear may still arise, but it doesn't lead. Doubt may still whisper, but it doesn't decide. Anxiety may still tremble, but it doesn't define. These feelings pass through you like weather, not identity. You witness them without collapsing into them. You breathe instead of bracing. You choose coherence instead of contracting. This is the threshold where self-regulation becomes self-recognition. You are no longer trying to shift. You are living as the one who shifts naturally. And from this vantage point, you begin to notice something subtle yet profound. Reality mirrors your state with increasing speed. Conversations change. Opportunities arrive aligned with your center. Relationships reorganize with less friction and more clarity. The external world becomes a reflection of the internal coherence you've established. Here's the pattern interrupt. You are no longer waiting for evidence before embodying the identity. Your embodiment creates the evidence. And once you taste that level of alignment, there is only one step left: the gentle integration, the quiet anchoring of everything you've learned, where the journey softens into a lived truth rather than an inspiring idea. That soft descent is waiting in the wind down. You can still feel the imprint of that last section, the sense of standing inside a self that no longer chases alignment because it is alignment. And from that steady center, the energy begins to settle, not as an ending, but as an exhale after a long, necessary remembering. This is where everything you've explored stops being theory and starts becoming quiet truth, woven into the way you move, breathe, and choose. Notice how the journey has shifted you, not in flashes of revelation, but in subtle reorganizations of awareness. You may sense a little more spaciousness in your chest, a little more quiet between thoughts, a little more willingness to trust the unfolding instead of wrestling with it. That's the real shift, not spectacle, but softness, not force, but permission. The ease you've been exploring isn't a technique to master. It's an atmosphere you cultivate, a way of relating to your inner world so steadily that your outer world can't help but echo it. You don't need to hold every insight perfectly. You only need to return to coherence a little more often than you return to contraction. Even that small tilt reshapes the horizon. Let yourself recognize something: you are not standing at the beginning of this journey anymore. You are already in motion, already practicing, already embodying. The shifts have begun, not with dramatic declarations, but with the simple willingness to meet yourself differently. And as you move forward, everything becomes invitation. A breath becomes alignment. A thought becomes a choice. A feeling becomes information rather than identity. This is the quiet revolution, the moment you realize you never needed to force your way into a new reality. You only needed to stop bracing against the one already waiting for you. If there's a final whisper to carry with you, let it be this: ease is not the reward. Ease is the doorway. Step through it gently, consistently, openly, and watch as the world responds to the person you've already begun becoming.